Hello, my name is Joel Christ. I'm a developer with iSawStone, and today I'm going to do a walkthrough that's going to illustrate how to create a web part that can read and write data to an external data source. We're going to illustrate using Visual Studio 2010 to create a visual web part that uses the BCS object model to work with an external content type based on the AdventureWorks customer entity. The web part we're going to create today has several prerequisites in order to be able to function correctly. The first is that it makes use of the AdventureWorks sample database. The next is that it uses an external content type that is based on the AdventureWorks sample web service that's provided with the SharePoint 2010 SDK. Now I've gone ahead and deployed the AdventureWorks, installed and deployed the AdventureWorks sample databases, which you can see here in SQL Server Management Studio. I've also deployed the web service, the SharePoint, or rather the AdventureWorks sample web service, and we can see, I'm looking at it here in the browser, you can see the operations that it supports. And I've also created an external content type here in SharePoint Designer based on that web service. And if we come over here and take a look at the external content types, you see that I've gone ahead and deployed it to SharePoint. The name of the external content type is WS Customer, and its namespace is in the contoso.com namespace. So I currently have now at this point here all of the prerequisites ready to go. We're now ready to go ahead and create our web part. Okay, so I'm going to come over here and I'm going to start up Visual Studio 2010 running as an administrator. And then on the start page, choose to create a new project. And then in the installed templates, I'm going to come over here and select Visual C# SharePoint 2010. I'm going to choose the visual web part template. And I'm going to name the project and solution customer web part. Say OK. Visual Studio asks me what site I want to use for debugging. I've gone ahead in the past and have used this site here, so I'm going to go ahead and accept that and say finish. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here in Visual Studio now is to add some references. The web part sample code that we're going to use today makes use of classes and enumerations in the Microsoft.Business Data namespace. It also uses the color object or color class in the System.Drawing namespace. So we need to add references to both of those. So I'm going to come over here, Solution Explorer, and choose to add a reference. Now I've already added references to these guys in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and select businessdata.dll and system.drawing and say OK. And we get our references added. Okay, now we're ready to come in here and in the ASCX file add the markup that's going to define the user interface for our web part. So let's go ahead and paste that in. If we take a look in design mode now of the web part, we can see that what we've got for our user control that's hosted by our web part is some verbiage at the top that's displayed here to explain how to use the web part. We have a status label here that we're going to use to display error messages or just status messages to the user when we complete operations. And then we have some text boxes here that allows the username to enter the external content type name, the namespace for the external content type, and then some text boxes here for the different fields on the customer entity that we're going to be working with, the customer ID, title, first, middle, and last names, email, and phone. And then we have buttons here that the user can click on to carry out the operations that we support, creating new customers, finding customers by ID, and updating existing customers. And then we have a clear all fields function that the user can click on this button to clear any data that's been entered in any of the other fields here. Alright, so now we're ready to come in here and add the code that's going to support and actually provide the implementation of our operations. So I'm going to right click on the design surface and say view code, and we get the ASCX.cs file here opened up. I'm going to go ahead and open up, or rather select everything that Visual Studio generated for me and replace it with my own code here that I had copied onto the clipboard. Okay, so let's take a look at what the code's doing. First, we see that we have some Microsoft Business Data namespaces pulled in with using statements here that are going to allow us to work with the BCS object model. And then down here in our user control implementation, we have three properties: entity namespace, entity name, and entity values are set. To to do pretty much anything with the object model, we need to know the name of the entity and the namespace that it exists in. And so we have, as we saw in the user interface that we showed for the web part, 2 text boxes that allows the user to enter those values. And then we have another property here that we're able to use down below to quickly determine whether or not both those values have been set, and then prompt the user to enter them if they haven't. So if we come down here next, we see the implementation of the customer creation code, or the customer creation operation. So this method here gets called when the user clicks on the Create New Customer button. First thing we do is we make sure that we have entity namespace and name. If not, we display a prompt to the user letting them know that they need to enter those values, and we return. And then down here in a try catch block, we have the using statement to get a SharePoint service context. And then using that, we're able to then get a reference to the BDC service, shared service, and the metadata catalog. From that, we then get an entity, or the customer entity that we're interested in, using a specified name and namespace. We get the fields on the entity, and then we go ahead and update the values of those fields using the values that the user entered in via the web part user interface. Once we have that, we then go ahead and call the creator method on the entity, specifying our values via the value dictionary here, and our line of business system instance. That goes ahead and creates, via the external content type and the AdventureWorks web service, then a new customer in the AdventureWorks database. It returns a new identifier here, returned by the backend. It represents the customer ID of that new customer. We update the user interface then to display that ID. Go ahead and show a prompt to the user, let them know the customer is successfully created, and then finish up. If there's any exceptions thrown, we set the status to display that we were unable to create the customer, and we display the message of the exception that was thrown. The next method we see is the find by customer, or find customer by ID method implementation. Again, we do the same check to make sure we have entity namespace and name. We provide some simple validation of the customer ID to make sure it's an integer. Call a helper method down below that all it does is it takes the text version, the string version entered in via the user interface, and tries to convert it to an integer. If that throws an exception, then we handle return false down below, and then we handle that here. Let the user know they got to enter a integer value for the customer ID, and we get out. If the customer ID looks like it's a valid integer, or is a valid integer, then we do the same thing up above. We get the BDC shared service and metadata catalog, get the entity using its name and namespace. We go ahead then and create an identity based on that specified customer ID. Get a method instance for the specific finder method on the entity, which we can use to find an instance of the entity by its ID. Once we have that, we then execute the specific finder method and get back our customer data in this iEntity instance here. We then use the data coming from the iEntity instance to set the values in the text boxes in our web part user interface to display the values for that customer that was specified by that ID that the user entered. And again, we handle any exceptions, displaying a message to the user if there was a problem. And finally, down here for the update functionality to update existing customers, again, we check to make sure we have entity namespace and entity name. Again, do our validation of our customer ID. Repeat the same steps, get our BDC shared service and metadata catalog instances or references, get the entity using the name and namespace, create an entity again. This time now we get a method instance for the updater method on the entity. Now the updater method is a little bit different. What we need to do is we need to be able to create an instance of a sales customer object here, which is what the web service works with on the back end when it talks to the database. And so looking at the sample code for the AdventureWorks sample web service, you can see in there that there's a class named sales customer that the update customer method exposed by the web service accepts. And this is what the schema or the layout of the sales customer class looks like. And so we need to work with the fields in this class using the appropriate layout. So what we do is we use type reflection to do that. So first we get the parameters on our method, on the update method, and then we use type reflection to go ahead and get type descriptors for the fields in our class. So first though, we go ahead and call this helper here, create default parameter instances, to actually get an instance then of a sales customer class created for us, and it does all the dirty work of going out and figuring out what the class looks like and creates us an instance of that. And then we use type reflection to get references or type descriptors on each of the fields in that object that was created for us. Once we have that, we're then able to go back and down here and set the values of each of those fields using the data that was entered by the customer in the text boxes in the web part user interface. Then finally, after we've set the values on the object, we then go ahead and call the execute method, passing in the method that we want to execute, which is our updater method, the line of business system instance, and then a reference to our param instances. So that's going to have our object that we filled out the values in here. And then we go ahead and let the user know that the customer is successfully updated. We have some helpers down here. We just use this helper to display the set property value prompt when the user needs to enter the external content type name and namespace. The clear all fields click handler just calls another helper called clear fields, which you use in multiple places down here, and all it does is set the fields or the text properties of the different text controls on the web part UI to empty. We have a validate customer ID again, and all we do here is try to convert the string version of the customer ID coming from the user interface to an integer. If it throws an exception, we return false. If not, if it was converted, then we return the integer version of the customer ID and just return true. Okay, so now we're ready to build and deploy our web part, and Visual Studio makes that very simple. I'm just going to come over here and right click on the web part project and choose deploy. And Visual Studio goes ahead and builds the web part assembly, generates all the necessary deployment files, a solution package for the web part, and goes ahead then and deploys it to SharePoint. Okay, so it looks like the deployment succeeded. Okay, so let's go ahead and use our web part in SharePoint now. So if I come in the browser and I've got the site open here that we deployed the web part to, I'm going to go ahead and choose to create a new page. Okay, and then on the new page dialog here, I'm going to specify customer web part test page for the name and hit create. Now on the new web part page, I'm going to click on the Insert tab on the ribbon here and choose to insert a web part. If I come over here in the categories and select the custom category, I see my visual web part that I created and deployed. And go ahead and now and click Add. And we get our web part displayed here with our user interface just like we designed it in Visual Studio. So let's go ahead and save the changes to the page. So let's use our web part. Now before we can do anything, we need to specify the external content type name and namespace. If we come back over here, we can see that our name of our external content type is WS Customer and the namespace is contoso.com. So let's enter those values in. Now before we can find a customer, which is the first operation we're going to test, we need to specify a customer ID. So I've gone ahead and opened up and performed a query against the AdventureWorks database here in SQL Server Management Studio. And we can see that I've got a query here that where if I specify a customer ID, I get a contact ID from the customer or the sales individual table and use that then to do a lookup into the person.contact table. And based on that customer ID, I get back a contact ID and all the information about that customer. So I've gone ahead and done that query with a value of 11,000 for the customer ID, and we can see we get back a customer, Mr. John V. Yang. So let's come back over here, specify that value, and say find by ID. And we get back the correct data. So it looks like that's working. Okay, now we can see that the digit here, the last digit in his phone number is a 1. Let's change that to an 8 and say update. And the web part says it successfully updated the customer data. Let's come back over here and re-execute that query. Notice the last digit is a 1. We re-execute and it's now an 8. So it looks like the update worked as well. So let's go ahead and try to create a new customer. So we're going to say clear all fields. And we'll leave the customer ID field blank. We'll say Mr. New, leave the middle name blank, customer. And we'll give a phone number of, alright, so that should work. So now if we hit create new, it says it successfully created the customer. Let's take a look. It says the customer ID returned was this. So let's come back over to here, enter that value in, and execute the query. And there's our Mr. New Customer, middle name left blank. There's our email address, and there's the phone number that we entered in, and it shows the correct modified date. So it looks like we're able to successfully find customers by ID, update existing customers, and create new customers. So by using Visual Studio 2010, it was very simple for us to create and deploy a visual web part that used the BCS object model to work with data via an external content type that was hooked up to the AdventureWorks web service to allow us to work with external data living in the AdventureWorks database.